Hi there, I'm Victoria Peat, and welcome along. Today I'm going to take the slot that I've been using for my foundation paper piecing quilt along, sew along, just because I thought people are used to seeing me come on air around this time. I've not scheduled it properly with everyone and made a big deal of it because, as you are aware, we are all at home, well, most of us are at home, and trying to deal with the children and everything else. I thought, oh, you know what, I don't even know whether I'm going to get to it or not, but I'm here. I may not be as organised as I'd like to be, but I'm here. And I thought today what I would do is I have got a quilt that I need to bind. So I'm doing machine binding. So I thought what I would do is just take you through how I do that process. If you watch the sew along with the spools of thread in week 4, I did talk a little bit about binding, but I've got this quilt to do, so I thought, why not just take the opportunity to do that with you guys today. So the quilt that I am going to be binding is one that you may have seen before. I've published pictures of it, but I hadn't actually put the binding on. So today is the day that I'm going to get that finished, because I'm taking the opportunity where I can to try and get a few jobs done and dusted where I can. So the quilt that I'm going to be doing is this one here, which is my point on point quilt that I launched earlier this year. And thank you so much to everyone that's bought a copy of the pattern. I was just astounded with how kind and generous you guys are in terms of supporting me and buying my pattern and actually making it up, because believe you me, buying a pattern and actually making it up are two entirely different things. So it's fabulous that so many of you bought a copy. The pattern itself is available in 4 different sizes. I've got a picture here for you of the, let me press that again. Those are the pattern pages, an example of the pattern pages, and this is a lovely, lovely blue version of the quilt that was made by a lady called Joanne, and it looks amazing. I really, really love it. So those are the sample pages. It comes in 4 different sizes, ranging from, we've got here to show you, this is the wall hanging version, which just makes the 4 blocks. I've got the second from largest size behind me here, and the one that I'm working on today in binding is the throw size. So you've got 4 different sizes, and the number of options that you've got on this quilt are vast. There's absolutely tons and tons of different options. So if you fancy making one, then you can. If not, just sit back and enjoy me watching me make some binding, or make the binding, applying the binding to my quilt. So in terms of what you're going to need, or what I'm going to use today to do my binding, is that I have got the quilt that I'm working on, which is this one here. I've got some binding already pre-made. I'll need my sewing machine. You'll need a rotary cutter and a marking pen of sorts. Doesn't matter what you use, chalk or a friction pen, whatever you're happy with. A quilting ruler. I try and use one that's not too big, because it's just for a little bit of measuring that we'll need to do. You'll need pins or clips if you prefer to use clips. You'll need an iron and a pressing surface. You'll need a nice full bobbin, because what you don't want to do is run out partway through attaching your binding. And you'll need a presser foot for your machine. Now, I'll use a combination of 2 different feet when I'm doing this. I will start off with something like a 1/4 inch foot, if you have a 1/4 inch foot. This one is on the Janome, is the foot O, but you don't necessarily need that. You could just use your plain standard foot. This one is a foot A. You might be happier using your walking foot. This is the one that comes with the 720. Or you may like to use, this is a foot that I'll not actually be using, but it's a prompt for me to remind you later on. You might want to use a stitch in the ditch foot if you have got one, but we'll come to that later as to whether you do or do not want to use one of those, but that's what we'll look at. So for the time being, I'm just going to have the Q, sorry, I keep calling it a Q because it's a 1/4 inch, but it's not, it's an O foot. So I'm going to place that one on my machine for the time being. Okay, so I'm just going to make a little bit of space because I don't need my pressing bits and pieces for the time being, so I'm just going to move those out of the way. My iron's not on at the moment, so don't panic. Remind me later, I need to pop that on later. Right, so to begin with, I'm not going to need my rotary cutter. I'm not going to need my my pen or my smaller ruler. I'm going to pop my bobbin in the machine, and let me just change off the camera onto here. When you are loading a top loading machine, you'll have this little plastic bit on the front, which has got a nice handy little reminder as to exactly how. Let me see if I can get that focused in here, maybe. So that's got a little reminder as to how you load your bobbin, plus it's got a couple of extra measurements on here which are quite useful. When you're loading a bobbin into a top loading machine, you always need to make sure that the thread that you've got on your bobbin is coming off on this left hand side. And think of it as like a letter P, that the thread is coming off and down here, and this is your tool bit here. So you need to place that in your machine that way down to create your letter P. I'll tend to hold the bobbin in place whilst I just thread the guide the fabric round the little path that it needs to follow. And then you just pop in your plastic guide over the top. Your machine, you may or may not with your machine, you may just be able to start sewing, and a lot of more modern machines you can just start sewing, but a lot of machines you need to just wind the hand crank towards you on the machine, holding the top thread, putting a little bit of tension on that, and just allow, when you're doing the hand crank, one full move, and that will allow the thread to travel one complete revolution around the bobbin in the bottom, go all the way around once, and once it's done that full pass, you'll then be able to just pull up that thread from underneath. So if you have got a machine where you need to do that, just pull that thread up and underneath and pull those threads through to the back of the machine. So that's your machine ready. When I am doing my quilt, I will have a look at the size of the quilt, and this is going to be very tricky with this small amount of space that I'm working with, is that you've got your sides all trued up, so they're all nice and straight. You've trimmed everything off. Like I say, this is one that I've been meaning to do for a while. It's been hanging on a wall like this, so it's a little bit thready on the edges, but you will true it up and make sure it's nice and neat edges. It's easier to work with something neat. What you can do if you like is you can go through either with a long basting stitch or even an overlock. You could do a 2-thread overlock around these outside edges just to try and make sure that these layers stay together. It will depend on how much quilting you've done. This I've only done very light quilting. I've done echo quilting around the sides of these diamonds, which is fine for this wadding, and for the purpose that this is going to be used for, it's absolutely enough quilting. But what you do have is you've got these little edges here that can pull away. I've done not thread, 505 spray. I've spray basted, that's the word I'm looking for. So I've spray basted, so these are together. If not, what you might like to do is run that basting stitch like 1/8 of an inch from the edge, a 2-thread overlock stitch, something like that around those outside edges, just to try and secure those all together when you come to attach your binding. With my binding strips, what I'll do is I'll just lay out the binding strips just to try and make sure that where you've joined your binding strips, you've got this diagonal seam. Hopefully you've got a diagonal seam. It works a lot better if you do. You've got that diagonal seam so that when you fold it in half, your seam is split across here, and then on the underside, it comes off at the other diagonal. Does that make sense? So what you've done is that seam allowance on the inside, you've spread out across a wider area as possible so that it's not all bulky in one place. But what I try to do is make sure that that join isn't on the edge. And if you follow me on Instagram, you will see that I did that exact thing the other day on my Spools of Thread mini. What you don't want to do is get the binding, that join on the binding, on this corner edge, because if you do that, it makes it so much more difficult to try and make a really nice mitered corner. So what I tend to do is I'll just lay out this binding around, and this is where the dining room table is very useful, as I will lay the binding out. I'll just move the machine, give me a bit more space, to try and make sure that that join isn't going to hit that corner. But what I'm going to do is when you join your binding is to just choose one edge where you're going to start. So I've chosen one of these long edges, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew the binding, leaving this gap in the middle, sort of 10 inches ish in the middle. So let me just stick a couple of pins in, And I'm not going to sew binding in this section to begin with. I'm going to leave this section so that when I've sewn binding all the way around and I come back round to this point, I want to join the binding in a really lovely way so that you can't see the join. It's not really bulky. So I'm going to leave that open for the time being. So I'm going to do is I'm going to start with quite a long tail. So I don't want to start my binding here, and you'll see here with this one I've even got the selvages is still attached. I'm going to leave quite a nice tail. So I've got, this is the gap that I need to be leaving. I'm going to leave quite a nice tail that will overlap. And I'm just going to pin that in place just to hold it. And then I'm going to walk the binding round the corners. Just give it a little fold at each corner, just to try and make sure, I'm just going off the table at the moment, just to try and make sure that those joins aren't hitting those corners. At the moment, fingers crossed, just working my way around the quilt. Oh, you see now what I've done is I've come to this edge here, this corner, and I've got this join. And so let me just bring that up a little bit. So it's kind of hitting a little bit close. So what I might do is, because I've got plenty of binding, is I might just shift everything a little bit this way. So what I'm actually going to do is make this part of the tail that little bit longer. And I'm going to walk it round again just to see whether that works okay. In a minute, I'm coming. Come on. Now, you know what, it's not the end of the world, but if you can avoid it, then avoid it. Okay, that's placed better when I've walked that round. So now I've got a really big long tail here. This is where it's really important when you're working out how much binding you need. Don't just do the two, don't just do the width. We go. Don't just do the two widths and the two lengths. Don't forget you also need that extra bit for doing that mitre in each corner, and then you need that overlap so that you can adjust the binding as and where you need to, and it makes it easier when you come to join the two binding pieces later. So I'll show you that as well. So that's what you need to bear in mind. Always make that a little bit more binding than you think you need. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start here where I've pinned, and I'm going to sew along. I'm not going to pin the binding in place. What you might like to do is you might like to re-wrap up this binding onto a piece of card or something just to try and keep it out of the way. It depends on how much quilt you've got, how much space you've got, as to whether you need to do that or not. I won't do that today, just to keep things as quick as possible. Right, what I need to do now is, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch from this edge, this raw edge, until I get to 1/4 of an inch from this lower edge. So I'm going to stop 1/4 of an inch away from there. So I'll stick a pin in so that you can see what I'm talking about. So I've just taken my little ruler and I'm going to mark a point 1/4 of an inch from that other side. And I've just put that pin through the quilt itself, not through the binding. So I'm going to start off at this point here, at the beginning pin, just do a bit of a reverse stitch, because when we come to join the binding later, I want to make sure that that's secure and it's not going to unravel itself. So I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch all the way down. I'm going to stop just at where this pin is. Don't sew through the pin, because we like our pins and we don't want to break a pin or damage ourselves or the machine. I'm going to stop where that pin is, and then I'm going to turn at a right angle and I'm going to sew towards the outside edge. So if I show you on this, if I just draw very roughly, I'm going to sew along to that pin and I'm going to sew out at a 45-degree angle. Let me just draw that. You see my grey here even more now. No hair dye here. Crikey. It's going to be desperate, desperate. Right, so can you see that, I'm hoping? So I'm going to be sewing along here, 1/4 of an inch from this raw edge. I'm going to sew the binding in place on top, and I'm going to stop at the pin, and then I'm going to sew outwards. So I'm hoping that once I've got the machine back in place and we change the camera, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Now, if you do have an extension table for your machine, it's absolutely fabulous to use when you're quilting, because what it does is it takes the weight of your quilt, it spreads it out over a larger area and you've got less drag on the quilt underneath your foot, underneath your presser foot. So I'm using my 1/4 inch foot, but you might be using your standard foot, your A foot, it's completely up to you. On this machine, I need to change to stitch number 4. Stitch 4. It's because I've got my presser foot up. This has got a double height lift on the presser foot. So if you lift up once, it just does your standard lift, but it's got a second lift that if you pull up the lever at the back, it holds in place. But if you do that, it doesn't allow you to change the stitch. So I'm now on the 1/4 inch. I'm going to slide the quilt underneath. I'm going to take one of those pins out because I didn't need both for this. I'm going to slide under. I'm going to make sure that the raw edges of the binding and the raw edges of the quilt are sitting up against each other. I'm going to place it underneath the machine. I'm taking out that pin because I don't have to be 100% accurate as to where I'm starting, but I've just made sure I've got enough of a gap. And I'm going to just do a little reverse stitch, or you could use a locking stitch, whatever you're comfortable with. And I'm going to make sure that these are matching the raw edges. I'm not pinning because they do have a tendency to, because you're sewing through so many different layers, what I don't want is for them to go skew-if and one to sew faster than the other and end up with, you know, a pleat or something like that. So I don't tend to pin my binding in place. And you'll have to excuse me because I've not got a lot of space on this table because I've got the cameras all set up. So you can see here, this is my little pin guide to show me where the end of the quilt is coming. And when I get to this point, there's a bit of spare thread. I'm just going to get as far as I can. With the 1/4 inch foot, you've got this little guide on the side, so it just means that you can't quite get the pin underneath very easily. So just lifting that out of the way, and I'm just going slowly just to make sure that I don't get to a point where I'm going to sew over the pin by accident. So I'll get close and then I'll hand crank and remove that pin. Once I've got to that point, I'm then going to lift my presser foot and I'm then going to turn the quilt and I'm going to aim for this little corner here, which is that 45-degree angle. And I'm just going to sew off the edge to that point. And I'm going to cut my threads. No reverse stitching. So let me see, can I show you on here? Maybe you can see on the reverse. So I've sewn down, I've got to that 1/4 inch, and then I've sewn diagonally out to that corner. So then I'll bring back over to my workspace. I'm afraid I haven't set myself up today with an iPad to see who's watching today. I'm sure there's not many people today because they didn't know I was going to be here. And the children have monopolised iPads. They're on their lunch break today. We're being very organised and just giving the girls like routine and they like structure. So they have a rough plan for the day. So they're on their lunch break at the moment. Right, so what I've done is I've taken the quilt and I'm laying that up with a line on my cutting mat just to try and keep things nice and straight. And I've taken the binding and I've folded the binding a 45-degree angle from this corner. So you've got a nice 45-degree angle. And the rest of the binding is going upwards. So this is creating one nice long straight line. And then what I'm going to do is fold back along in line with this edge here. So I'm going to take the binding back over on itself and making that fold on this edge. And then this binding should then come and sit nice and straight here. So I'm going to stick a pin in here so I can show you. That's created a little fold here. I'm going to bring that up to the camera. So that's created this little fold. And then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start from this edge and I'm going to sew all the way down to the other end with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to start right off, so I'm not moving in, I'm not starting in anywhere, I'm just going to sew from this edge all the way along. But what I'm going to do first is on this other end is where I'm aiming for, is I'm going to mark that 1/4 of an inch again with a pin, so I know where to stop and to pivot my stitches. So bring this back over to the machine. Nice and neat. I'm going to place that fold underneath my presser foot, press the foot down, and I'm going to start sewing. So we'll just sew a couple of stitches, then I'm going to take my pin out. You don't have to put that pin in, you might want to use a clip or something like that, but that's just enough to keep it in place and keep that fold nice and neat. So now I'm going to sew all the way down, making sure that I'm keeping the binding raw edges level with the raw edges on my quilt. Oh, and that thread's just come undone. Let me just, machine's just gone squiffy. That top thread's disappeared. Where's that gone? Just re-thread that. Okay, let's start again. Sorry about that. Press the foot back down and let's go. So just as I go along, just adjust. Sorry, this is very hairy binding. It's been sat around far too long, waiting to be bound. Naughty. I must say, I am very bad at picking up and doing other projects before finishing the one that's waiting to be done. Again, if you follow me on Instagram, you will know that I've just done an English paper piecing project that I probably shouldn't have started before I finished something else I'm working on. But I don't know, I just find that sometimes I need to be in the mood for a certain type of stitching, or I need something to do in front of the television, or I need something that's not too taxing for the brain, and so I like to have a variety of projects on the go. And that is my excuse, and I am going to stick to that wholeheartedly. Just going to work my way along. Oh, that thread's just broken. I wasn't enjoying going at that speed. Sorry about that, people. We shall go again. Okay, let's just see how far we got with that, and I'll try again. Just turn the speed down on my machine. It's obviously not enjoying that today. Now I've managed to get it all twisted around the needle. Oh no, okay. We're on. Just to double check that that's stitching it is. It looks like a bit of a mess on the back, but that's okay. We're okay. Just readjust as and where you need to. And sometimes when you're stitching along, you'll find that this might bubble up a little bit. Just lift it up and reposition it as and where you need to. sew up to that pin. It's coming. And then I'm going to lift my presser foot, turn the quilt, and then sew into that corner. And then looking back overhead, we're going to make that nice and straight. Fold it up, get that nice 45-degree angle here. Fold up and back. Now, one thing I didn't mention is that I have sewn this to the. I'm sewing this to the front of my quilt, and I'm going to wrap over and fold it to the back, and then I'm going to machine from the front. You can, of course, machine to the back and fold to the front and hand stitch to the front. There's lots of different ways that you can do your machine quilting, but for today, this is the method I like to use, where I stitch to the front, I wrap to the back, and then I'm going to stitch in the ditch to secure it in place. But I'm going to talk about a couple of different methods that you can use. So that along this edge. This one's a long edge. Are you ready? Are you ready? Come on, thread. Place that down. Sewing from that folded edge. I really have got threads all over me. Lucky I'm not doing the school run at the moment. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, this staying indoors thing, isn't it? We can go out and exercise, but I'm not exercising nearly as much as I do normally. I normally do just short of 2 hours of walking a day for taking the children to and from school. And I'm going out for a little walk, but to get some fresh air and to stop the madness setting in. But I must say I'm not getting anywhere near 2 hours. I think I managed about 15 minutes yesterday. But in Gibraltar, we're having stinking weather at the moment. We've had terrible, terrible rain. We've had absolutely tons of it and so much wind. We live on a marina, as some of you are aware, and I've just realised this is in a very short stitch length. Let's just increase that. We live on a marina, and we get a couple of super yachts that park up every now and then, and they actually left the marina because it was we were getting a swell and a really massively high tide, and the winds have just been incredible. So they've moved out of the harbour for the time being, and they've gone out into the Bay of Gibraltar, I think, as it's a little bit safer for them. But today the sun is out, which is wonderful, because I've been very jealous of friends with all their lovely, we're going for a lovely walk in the countryside, and I'm thinking, I'm stuck in a flat and it's stinking outside. Oh, what I haven't done is I haven't put my pin in the other end. That's okay. Sew a little bit further. So what are we thinking? We're thinking we like the orange binding. This is from the Bijou range. I can't remember which colour this one was. But I quite liked it as a nice contrast to the greens. Is it cinnamon? I can't remember. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop just because it's got quite a nice flat bed on here. I'm going to mark up that 1/4 inch so you can see what I'm doing. Stick a pin in. If you do that, just make sure that on the underside you haven't created a little pleat on the backing fabric. A little bit further. pin out, lift and turn, and sew into the corner. And that's one of those things that the more often that you do it, you'll be able to start doing it by eye when you feel comfortable. Turning the corner again. Nice straight edge. Quilt binding up. I'm so covered in thread. And fold it back down. Oh gosh, I haven't got an iPad to see if there's any questions. If there are, I'll make sure I answer them afterwards. So back over to the machine. Do you reckon I should shout for one of the children? I need an iPad. So sewing along. Feels odd having this machine on a slower speed, but obviously that thread wasn't liking the faster speed. It's one of the things I love about this machine is the stitch speed. It does, I think it's 1,200 stitches a minute, and it's fab. It's so good. Sorry, I've got my hairy frayed bits. More to go. What's everyone watching on TV to keep themselves amused? You're still watching Natasha. She's beavering away, that girl. She works so hard. And John's been on with his distance presenting. I've enjoyed that. He was on with Katie Jones the other day, and Emma Bradford was on as well. And shame, John was stuck in one half of the studio and his guests in the other. That wasn't great for John. And then Sewing Street, they're working doubly hard because they've decided not to have any guests in because they're working in a much smaller studio, temporary studio for the time being. Oh my word, both Debbie and, well, I say both, there's three of them, Debbie, John and Vix are all working so hard trying to bring everyone content and wonderful things to buy and look at and demos. Working hard. But Neil put a really good post online the other day. He said, do continue to buy if you can. So you don't go spending money when you haven't got it. But if you can, support people because they in turn are supporting suppliers. There's a number of quilting shops that are still open for business, if you like. Do support them because they're buying from suppliers, and we need everybody to be in a good position when we get to the other end of this mess. Right, so again, I've not put that pin in, so I'll mark that for you here, so you can see where I'm sewing up to. Pin out, pivot, and sew into the corner. Okay, now we've come back onto the side that we started on. So this is where I started here, and I'm going to sew up to this point. So we've left ourselves a nice big gap for joining the binding. So as I did before, fold up and back down. And can you hear my husband? He's just through the wall. Our bedroom's on the other side. And I tell you, he's not drawn breath, the poor guy. He's on conference calls. He's been at home now. This is his second week. I think it's his second week at home of working from home. And oh my word, he's just so many conference calls. He just doesn't stop. Absolutely doesn't stop. Hard work. Sounds like, it makes me laugh, always reminds me of Snoopy. So you remember the Snoopy cartoons, the people in Snoopy cartoon never had a voice. They were always wah 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 wah. Was it Snoopy? the mum voice, not the children, not the, like the Peanuts children, but it was the adult voice. That's what he reminds me of through the wall, chatting away. Up to approximately up to that point. Do a back stitch or a locking stitch. Sorry, I didn't put that on the sewing machine. I meant to. Failing at directing. I didn't get a job anytime soon as a director. Not pressing the buttons properly enough. Okay, so what we've got here, I'm just going to move the sewing machine a little bit, give me a bit more space. So what we've got here is our starting point and our ending point, and what we now need to do is to join these two pieces of binding. Now what you can do is you can just have the end of your binding, and you can take your next piece, pretend that was shorter, you can take your next piece and open it out and sort of tuck that in, wrap it over and round, but does that make sense? So you'd slide it in. But what I find is that then this gets really, really bulky, and that's really difficult. By the time you've wrapped that over and round, you're going to get a really big, bulgy piece here. So ideally what you do is you sew them together as you do with your binding strips at a 45-degree angle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to aim to join these two somewhere in the middle. Doesn't have to be exact. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just choose a point here, and I'm going to trim off this excess. So I'm going to place this on top of my mat, take a ruler, and I'm going to trim off one piece. Sorry, one half. So I'm going to chop that off. So this is my starting point. This other tail here, I'm going to lay on top. So my underside piece here, where that hits the piece that's lying on top, is here. So that is the underside piece, the piece on top laid on top with a pin placed where these two pieces meet. Hope that makes sense. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure from that first pin the width of your binding. But what I'm going to do is, the way I like to do it, is the width of my binding plus a 1/4 of an inch. So I've got 2.5 inch binding. So on top of that, I need another 1/4 of an inch. So that's 2 3/4 of an inch from this pin. So they'll then overlap by the width of the binding plus a 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to place this on my mat, just so that I can show you. I'm going to mark 2 taking the lid off the pen, 2 3/4 of an inch. So I shall mark that so that you can see it. So I'm using the lines on my mat, making sure that this is nice and straight, which I hadn't done. Come on, be professional. And this is not a friction pen, this one is a Uniball pen that I got, I think I got it at the range, much cheaper than friction. So what I've done is I've taken, you've got your lower piece, you've got your piece laid on over the top, you've got a pin where they meet, and then from that pin is the width of the binding plus a 1/4 of an inch. I'm then going to chop at that line to take off this excess. Place that on the mat. And cut. So you don't need to mark and cut, you can just cut, but I just wanted to mark that so that I could show you what I was doing before I did it. And trim that. So these are your excess binding that you can put in your scraps bin, do some quilt as you go or something. Great to save for another time. So now what we need to do is attach these two tails together. I might need to turn this around the other way because my brain is not working. to be able to do it the other way. So I'm just going to roll up the excess quilt so I can try and get it on the table. Oh, that was pretty squeaky. Right. Now what we need to do is join these two ends together. So I'll take my first piece. I like to do the piece coming from my right, just because that's what works for me. And I will open that out and place that right sides facing uppermost. I'm then going to take the other piece and I'm going to open it out and place it on top of this one. As you can see, this doesn't really work very well. So if you've got this nice big gap, what you can do is just fold it a little bit, scrunch your quilt up so you can lay that. It's not going to do that now I've rolled it. I'm going to place that on top. Okay, so you've got your one coming from one side, right side uppermost, the one coming from the other side. Don't twist it, you just need to open it out and place it on top. Now, if you hadn't added on that extra 1/4 of an inch, what you would need to do is to place these exactly raw edges meeting on this side and this side. I like to add that extra 1/4 of an inch, so I'm just going to overlap or overhang, if you like, let it overhang, that makes more sense. That little 1/4 of an inch here and a 1/4 of an inch here. I'll pin that and then I'll bring it up closer to the camera so that you can see. Just stick a couple of pins in so it doesn't move around. But you do want it to be exactly at the right angle. So these are at an actual right angle to each other, but I've just got that little overhang. Putting in a few pins. You don't need to put all these pins in. I just want to be able to bring it up to the camera so that you can see what I'm doing a little bit closer. Okay, come in. Right, so I've overlapped those two pieces. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, and you can either eyeball it or you can draw a line. So I'm going to sew from one little corner here to the other one here. So I'm going to just draw a line so that you can see where I'm stitching or where I intend to stitch. So from that little valley V section, so if you haven't added that extra 1/4 of an inch in, you're just going from corner to corner. But I find it easier if I've got this little section here and this one here to aim at. I'll just move the machine back across. And this time I might even change the camera angle. Look at that. Or what I will do is I'm just going to change from my 1/4 of an inch foot to my standard foot. And my standard stitch. Oh no, I've just put on a curly whirly stitch. We definitely don't want that one. Not yet anyway. So I'll start off, just hold the thread because you don't want the thread to go back up into the machine. Hold the thread, put the needle in the down position. I'll then put where I'm starting, this start point, this little V, I'm going to place up against the needle. I'm going to hand crank 1 or 2. That just means that you've got enough fabric underneath the presser foot, because if you haven't got a lot of fabric underneath the presser foot, it can sort of get sucked in and drawn into the machine, and you don't want that. If you've got a straight stitch plate on your machine like this 720 does, use that because that makes a massive difference. So I'm now going to sew. If you've drawn your line, you can follow your line, or you might have another marking on your machine, or you might eyeball it, up to you. If you've got 10,000 pins in the way, remove those. And sew to that other point. point, you can then have a look and see, don't trim anything yet, when you straighten out your binding, oh, squeaky again. When you straighten out your binding again, ignore this little bulky bit here, just fold it over and just make sure that it feels like from this point of stitching at this end and this at this end, that it kind of sits flat, that you've not got an extra bit or it's pulling really tight. Try and make sure that it sits nice and flat. If it's not quite right, you can go back in and re-stitch that seam that you've just done. So just make sure that you're happy first, that that's lying flat. If you are, you can then go and trim this, but you don't want to trim it and then go to sew it in place and then go, oh my goodness, it's too tight or it's too baggy, and you've already chopped off all your seam allowance. It makes this a lot more difficult to deal with. So measure first and then decide that you're happy, and then you can chop off this excess. So I'll take my little ruler. This is where little rulers are actually quite useful. And chop off that excess. I'm placing a 1/4 of an inch marking line on the stitching line that I just sewed. Pull that off, and then I'm going to just snip off these 2 little doggies, which would be so much more meaningful if I didn't have all this other thread. And then I would press with the iron, but I've realised I've not turned my iron on yet. And the children are in the other room playing a game or something. They got out all the Lego the other day, it was fabulous. Just finger press that. And then when you pull it round, it sits nice and flat along your quilt. And you can see here, you've got your part of your seam running here and the other part of your seam is running in this direction, so you can see that you've split that seam allowance. This is where I will pin, because if you're using a walking foot, what you can sometimes find is that once you start sewing at this end, it will start to bubble and create a point at which you end up with excess fabric at this end. So what you don't want is to have this little mountain arriving. So I will pin this one section. Make sure your hairy bits aren't all in the way. Well, that sounds rude, doesn't it? Hairy bits. Okay. So I'm just going to stick in a couple of pins. And then I'll go back to the machine and I'm going to sew from where I left off last time back to the beginning. Machine round, I might put my 1/4 of an inch foot back on. Oh. Now I need to go back to my 1/4 of an inch, go slightly bigger stitch. Let's do it again with that thread. Oh, it's not a happy thread. The wheels are falling off, help, help. No, my needle thread is not working. Oh, for goodness sake. There we go. I think I've missed the guide at the top. Back to a 1/4 of an inch stitch. Pins out as you go, and just even out any excess that tends to pop up. Now I really need an assistant to go and turn my iron on. See if I can knock on the wall. Yes, can't put my iron on. No one needs help. Pushing a bit closer. Now I make my own pin cushions, but this one, oh, I love this one. I got this one from Beyond Measure. Oh, if you've seen her at any of the shows, she sells beautiful, beautiful sewing tools and bits and pieces. And this one's a beautifully, oh, just so tactile. This wood is gorgeous, and it's got some tweed in the middle. It's lovely. Okay, so I'm just going to leave this here for you, and I'm just going to turn on my iron for the next stage. Here we go, so that's all sewn in place. Just pop my iron on. And move the machine out of the way. So we don't need the machine for the time being. So that is the binding all in place all the way around the quilt. So this is where I've got my join, and that's nicely sewn in place, and that seam allowance is spread out. So what I like to do now is I like to go round and get rid of some of these threads, and I will press the binding away from the front of the quilt, because I just find that makes a really nice, neat finish, and makes doing these mitered corners a little bit easier. Just get a pair of scissors. Far too big for the job, but they're okay. So I'm going to press, and as I go along, I might just trim off some of these bits and pieces. So I've just got a prim mini iron and a wall pressing mat. You don't need it either, but they're handy. Flip that binding away. I'm just going into the corners to try and push those out. Other thing sometimes nice to do is use your stitch ripper, just to get some of those little bits. And have you seen Natasha selling House of Alistair wool pressing mats, the really thin ones? I'd love to try one of those because I like the size of them as well. But this one, this wool pressing mat, I love it. I really, really love it. For patchwork, it is fabulous. Everything is so crisp, it's lovely. I don't know if Natasha had any left. She did have something the other day on air, saying that she had some, or was it on Facebook? Tidy things up. Okay. Come to this next corner. Flip everything back. Into that corner. And along. These are my gingham scissors that I bought actually when I went to America years and years ago. I went to Mood Fabrics, and oh man, it was amazing. Mood Fabrics was just an amazing store. It was just vast, so big, and it was so lovely just to have a bit of a mooch round. But I did have a limit on my luggage, so I didn't really buy a lot of fabric. I bought a few bits and pieces, but then I treated myself to these scissors and my duck-billed scissors, which are super. If you've not used duck-billed scissors before, they are absolutely super for dressmaking and patchworking. Great for grading seam allowances. I'll show you those. I'll do a video on those one day if you like. Let me know. Leave something in the comments if you're still watching me finding my quilt and you'd like to see duck-billed scissors. I can do a demo on those. I'm pressing into the corners. Ooh, hot. Okay. See, that's the penance you get for leaving projects half done. You get too much frayage on your bits and pieces, your binding and your tops. Surely I can't be the only one that does that. Multiple projects. Distracted by something else pretty. Oh, let me do that. Before you know it. And I swore, because we're over in Gibraltar, I didn't bring everything I own, because there was never going to be enough room. And I thought, right, I'll be really, really strict and only bring fabric for projects I'm working on and only work on one thing at a time. I'm going to be really disciplined. And I'll tell you, it's gone out the window, because I'd come back for either sewing quarter or sewing street demonstrations or visiting friends and family. And I just sneak in a bit of a fabric every time I visited. And before you know it, you've suddenly got a big old stash and nowhere to put it and not enough hours in the day to get them all done. Guilty, guilty. And here we go, back round to the beginning. Right, so I'm just going to turn that iron off because it's only got a little cord. Well, it doesn't have a little cord, it's just the way I've got my setup. Just the way I've got my setup means that I could quite easily knock that over. Right, let's get rid of some of those threads. Stitch ripper away and my scissors away. Right, so once you get to this point, you've got a couple of different options as to what you can do with your quilt. The way I tend to do this is I will fold over to the wrong side, not the wrong side, that's harsh on the back. You might have some beautiful backing fabric. I'll fold over to the back and I will stitch from the front in the ditch, or sometimes I might sew just onto the binding. So you can do it that, and that's the way I'm going to show you today. Your other option is that you fold over to the back, and you might like hand sewing. You might have some time on your hands, who knows? Oh, not funny. And then you can hand stitch onto the back. Another option you have, and this is a quilt that I did, that I designed for sewing quarter using Lewis and Irene fabrics. It was the Britannia one. Let me see if I can hold it up, and so that you can see. You might remember it with these gorgeous London prints. Too close to the camera. Oh no, it's upside down. Trust me. This one. With half square triangles and whatnot. So I did that one for sewing quarter, and the time scales on sewing quarter were always a little on the tight side, shall we say. And just because it was really quick and actually looked really nice, I chose on my machine, I've got a wiggly stitch. So I followed the exact process that I've done with this so far, and then on top of that, instead of sewing in the ditch, which is what I'm going to attempt today, be patient with me, I've just done a wiggly line all the way around the outside. It's really quite forgiving and it looks quite pretty. So that's another option, is to have a look at those decorative stitches and see if there's something there that works well for you. So now we have got to try and create these mitered corners. We need to fold this round to the reverse. At the same time, you want to make a mitered corner that looks nice on the front and looks nice on the back. So the way I will do this is I like to use my long pins. I'll either use my glass-headed pins, or I will have a flower head pins. I don't know if I've got any of those to hand. Oh, look, here's one. These are clover head flower-headed pins. I quite like these as well. They come in a red and pink. Now in the packet, it looks like you get red pins and pink pins, but you don't. They're red on one side and sort of pink on the other. There's also blue ones, and the difference between the blue ones and the reddy pink ones are the width of the length of the pin. Is how thick those are. But either those or these ones I find really useful because they're nice and long. But I've got loads of these yellow glass head pins. So I'll start off, and I will have the quilt with the right side facing uppermost, or the side where you've done the machine stitching facing uppermost. And I'll fold the binding round to the back. And you can see by doing the pressing with the iron, it makes this a lot easier and a lot more regular looking. and you're folding it round to the back, and your aim is obviously to hide this row of stitching that you've just done to attach the binding to the top of the quilt. So you're folding it to the reverse. Now from the front, you can feel with your fingers when this folded edge of the binding sits just past this stitching line. So what you can do is you just want, it's not even 1/8 of an inch, I would say. It's, well, it might be, yeah, it's near 1/8 of an inch, somewhere between nothing and 1/8, maybe 1/16. Just underneath, you can just feel where that goes, so that you can just stick your pin through the background fabric just to the inside of where your binding is, and on the other side you can see it just catches that edge of the binding, that very folded edge right on the outside. So I'll stick those in and you can work your way along. I always make sure, because it's going through the machine this way, I'm sewing along the machine this way, that all my pins are sort of towards me. So if I'm sticking the pins in and I've got the quilt in front of me, I will make sure that my pins are on my right hand side. This is my right hand side because I'm this side of the quilt. I know this is all upside down and a bit confusing, but from my right hand side the glass head pins are going in that direction. So I'll stick a couple in, and how many you stick in is depending on how comfortable you are with the sewing machine and how many pins you have. I will just make sure every time I flip over, make sure that I've not all of a sudden, and I'll stick one in really badly and too tight. You can wrap this round and it may look like on the front that I've pinned in exactly the right place, but on the back you'll see here, this is the one that I'm happy with. You can see how it's just a little bit from that edge, whereas this one I've pulled it too tight and you can see the back of the pin, but there's loads of excess fabric. You really don't want all of this because you'll have a really massive amount flapping loose. So don't pull it too tight on the front. If you do want a really tight binding, start off with binding strips that are 2 1/4 inches versus 2 1/2 inch strips to start off with. So to do the corner, I'll just do a couple of pins going along this way, and then I'll do a couple of pins this way. I will leave the corner, so I'll stick in a pin about here. So I'm just going to turn that over, and I'm just making sure that as you're turning, that this edge of the quilt isn't folding or pleating or anything. 2 hands for that. Just make sure it sits nice and flat. Stick the pin in and check, and I'll do another one just to make sure that I'm not going off at an angle. Okay, so now we've got this little corner. So from the front it looks quite nice. That's kind of already doing its bit because of the way that we've sewn those edges. And from the back we need to somehow do something to fold this section. So I'll try and make sure that the this piece of binding comes up towards me here, and then I'll take this edge here and I'm going to fold it over to make a little V. So that's not too bad for a first attempt, but I always find it needs a bit of jiggery pokery just to try and make sure that you're getting a nice fold. You want to make sure that the edge of this fold sits on this corner. So once I'm happy with that, I'll take a pin, and I'm going to keep this the back of the quilt facing uppermost, and I'm going to pin with a glass head pin sticking out of the outside edge of the quilt, so holding it in place, trying not to draw blood, and I'll go in and out, in and out to try. Oh, sorry, I dropped that. So I've got my glass head pin sticking outside, so that when I come to sew from this side, you've got your glass head pin and you know where that is, but it's just holding in place this little section, so that when I come to sew across the top, I can sew all the way along to here, and I can turn and pivot and go the other way, but it means that I can see with this glass head pin when I need to pull that out. So I'll repeat that on all the corners. I'm just going to go round and round. So amuse yourselves as I just stick in a few more pins all the way around. See, this is where I need my iPad to see if anyone's got any questions, and then I can scroll back and see. But there you go. We are where we are. But I hope you're all coping all right and you're not too bored or lonely. I'm pretty sure you won't be bored, because if you're watching me, it means that you like sewing, and if you like sewing, then you've probably, like me, got tons of fabric lying around. But you might be lonely, because there's plenty of people I've seen that have said they're on isolation for months, and oh my word, I've managed a week with my husband, who's not on isolation, but he's, you know, working from home, and less than a week with the children, and it's hard. It's really hard. I think we try and aim to do too much, especially parents trying to educate children from home. The school are doing a fantastic job, but it is hard trying to keep everyone on track and keep your sanity at the same time. So I'm still folding over to that wrong side. I'm just feeling underneath. You can just feel when there's enough space. Sticking my pin in, and every time I'm just checking. See, I've gone a little bit scant on that one, so just fold it a little bit more. I'm going to fold that corner. So again, the right side is fine. The wrong side just needs folding. Fold up and okay. Oh no, that one's miles off. Try again. That one's better. Pin from the outside edge through those layers. Again, that's where it's really helpful to have a longer quilting pin. So you can go in and out, because it is quite a few layers that you're going through. Okay, so that's that corner done. And I'll work my way along. Another pin in. Check it from the wrong side. I quite like a machine binding, but I know so many people much prefer a hand binding. I think maybe I'm just a touch on the impatient side. What do you think? For my hand stitching, I'd rather do EPP than hand sew binding on a quilt. Makes me sound terribly lazy, doesn't it? It's looking good. If you're looking for something to do, I know John Scott, he is looking for donations of dolls, little cloth dolls that are used to help children with traumatic life circumstances, and they're after some homemade dolls. And yes, he's taking donations for those. He's got a PO box number for that. But Anna Sewing Nut Smith, she did or started a little tutorial. She's got a pattern for a cloth doll online. So she started off with a tutorial last night, and she did the pattern, how to join the pattern, and how to transfer the pattern onto how to join the pattern, how to transfer it onto fabric, and how to sew that and turn it through. And she did some stuffing as well. So have a look if you're looking for a project, because there does come a point where you think, I'm not sure I need any more quilts in my life. I've not quite hit that point yet, so I'm getting close. And you're just looking for something else to sew. And, you know, charity quilt making is wonderful, but sometimes you might be looking for something different to do. And a bit of toy making is a bit of fun. And, of course, it will bring children so much joy and happiness. Or it will help them in their situation. It's not a great situation that some children find themselves in. So that's a lovely project to get involved in if you're looking for something. Right, so we're back to another corner. So the front's looking quite nice. That's folded nicely. And I'm just going to manipulate the fabric to try and get that folded in. Sometimes they behave more than others. Okay, so I'm happy with that. I'll stick my pin through the layers of that fold on the mitre, in and out, and through the quilt, and along. So if you missed it at the beginning, the quilt I'm working on is from my own pattern, which is a point-on-point quilt. This is the second size of 4, so this is the second smallest size, which is perfect for a lap quilt, cot quilt. You know what I mean? I don't necessarily mean to put in a cot, because I know we have to be very, very careful about what you put in a cot with a baby, but it's that kind of smaller size. Great for a play mat. Whenever I used to travel with the children, I used to take a small quilt this kind of size, you know, when they're crawling and you just can't hold them and you just can't keep them in a pram all the time. It used to drive them crazy. So I'd always put something like this down on the floor, just to give them a place to play and a place to feel like they've got a bit of freedom, but they're not on the grotty floor. You know, I'm just thinking like airports and that kind of thing. So I'm just folding that corner in. But this point-on-point pattern that I've got is just full of a ton of variations. I think that's part of the reason why quilting is so appealing to so many people, is that you can use exactly the same pattern as someone else, but come up with something wildly different if it's your fabric choices or the way that you lay out the blocks. And with this pattern, I've included loads and loads of different variations on what you can do to create something that's really unique. And it might be just changing the orientation of the blocks, or it could be the way that you use your fabrics. It's got tons in there. It's looking okay. Just continually checking each time those pins. Thread. Yeah, just making sure that those pins are just catching the binding evenly on the other side. So I'm quite tempted to do a decorative stitch on this one, but no, I'll show you in the ditch, as long as you don't judge me when I go wrong. Because I don't have a stitch in the ditch foot, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Hold on. Getting carried away. Right, okay, so that is my quilt. It's all pinned and it's ready to sew. What I will do is that I'm going to use, let me think, I'm going to use my standard A presser foot, my clear presser foot, because it gives me a good view of where you're going. You could use your walking foot if you prefer, or this isn't one, this is a blind hemming foot, but you could use a stitch in the ditch foot that looks remarkably similar. It has this little bar in the middle of the foot to guide where the stitch that goes through the ditch. The difference between that one and the blind hem foot is that the blind hemming foot has got a little bump part way along, and that helps you with your needle placement. So it's a similar foot, but it is a little bit different. I'm going to go with my clear foot. I must say I could do with sitting down to do this, but we will give it a go. So your options are, you can stitch in the ditch, which is what I'm going to do. You can stitch. Oh, I've just pinned my just pulled my trousers. That's annoying. Right, so you can stitch in the ditch, which is what I'm going to aim to do. What you could also do is stitch just sort of a scant 1/16 of an inch from that fold, or of course you can just hand stitch on the other side. It's up to you. But I'm going to aim to do a stitch in the ditch as we go along. Let's move some of these feet out of the way. A bit of space. Oh, now I'll put my pin cushion here. Oh, I can't believe I just pulled my trousers. Rubbish. Right. So I'm going to place the quilt underneath my presser foot. I'm going to hand crank down to try and make sure that I get that very first stitch in the gap that's just between my binding and my background fabric. Now what you can do is that you can choose a colour of thread that matches your background fabric for the top of your your stitch, and then in the bobbin you can have a colour of thread that matches your binding so that you don't see the stitching as much. It's up to you what what you want, or whether you want to make a feature of something. But don't be too hard on yourself though if it goes wrong, because you know what, from a distance no one's ever going to notice, are they? So you can do that. What you just need to make sure is do a little bit of a test on a scrap of the quilt sandwich or something, just to make sure that your thread is balanced, because if you're using two different coloured threads, when they join you need to make sure that they sit absolutely flat and that the top thread isn't pulling through to the bottom, or the bottom thread isn't pulling through up to the top, because you'll get those little bumps of colour. So just make sure that your thread is evenly matched, and that you might need to play with your tension or something just to make sure that that's nice and evenly balanced. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew along. I'm going to hold my breath a lot and just try and make sure that I don't sew on the binding. My aim is to not sew on the binding as I go around. I've just started part way. I haven't started on a corner because I don't like to start on corners, because I find it easier to pivot there rather than to start there. So I'm going to just start on one of my edges. As I'm going along, my next pin isn't till here, but what I'm doing is I'm holding this bit flat, and underneath you can just feel there's a little bump underneath where this fold of binding sits just a little bit to the left of this join, and that's where I'm aiming to catch with the stitching from this side, but you can feel it as you go. So don't take your pins out too far in advance, and just off you go. Take it easy, try not to go onto the binding, and try not to swear when you do, because I do tend to do that. I'll try not to do that today. But I do find this, whilst this feels like quite a long process, I find it more satisfying than hand stitching. Have I moaned enough about hand stitching binding on yet? Right, so I've got close to this pin. I'm going to take this pin out. I'm going to just make sure that that's sitting nice and flat. Now what you can do is, when you're going along, you can just turn here just to double check that you've got your stitching catching the binding on the back, or you can just have faith in yourself that you have stuck your pins in the right place and you've been even with that, and just deal with that at the end. Because sometimes it's easier just to deal with that as a problem at the end, rather than as you're going along and just getting really cross and frustrated with yourself. And just making sure that that fold's going under and I can feel it. Dear, I've just had a clunk in the other room. That sounded like a technology device landing on the floor. Let's hope not, because we're not going out to buy another one. Okay, so I'm going to go along. This is where I've got my pin in the corner. I'll just pull it out a little bit to make sure that I can see where I'm going, and I'm going to sew along, but when I get to the corner I'm going to slow right down, and I may even want to just hand crank just to try and get right into that corner, and you can feel when you're hand cranking where that needle's going, just to make sure that it's not hitting the pin. And then you lift your presser foot and place it back down, take that pin out. I'll just hand crank once or twice just to make sure I'm going in the right direction and I'm in the right place, and then I'll start sewing again. Just rearrange the excess quilt, make sure that that binding is nice and evenly folded. Take my pin out, I'm going to sew the end of the pin. And just feel that fold of the binding. To put up with me with unmanicured nails as well. Just scrape some grey hair, unmanicured nails. I've got makeup on though, that's a special treat for you guys. My hair was washed relatively recently. It might be grey, but it's clean. Now last week on a Friday I ran a sit and sew session where I had a video call with a few people. I had intended to do it with a lot of people, but I'd read some outdated information as to how many people you could have on a video call at once, and I got it all wrong. But I think I've decided that to run a video call with maybe somewhere between 4 and 6 of us in total might be quite nice. And it was just a session where we just chatted and did sewing as if it were a sewing group. So I think I might do that tomorrow. I realise this is quite last minute notice, but I thought that might be quite nice to do that tomorrow. So I'll post something online. I was oversubscribed last week, so what I'll do is I'll pop it up and then I'll pick some names at random, and it'll be lovely to have a few people just to chat sewing and catch up and meet some new people. That would be really nice. So I'll do that tomorrow, I think. May get the old child joining in. You never know. The girls might come and join me. So my youngest wants to learn to knit. So I am going to attempt to try and teach her to knit, but I don't have any of my knitting stuff with me. We had a couple of balls of wool, and we went to the craft shop before everything closed down in Gibraltar the other day, and I picked up 2 small pairs of knitting needles, but I didn't think it through, and I've only got 2 knitting needles. And really, I think I could do with a pair for me as well, so that I could show her what I'm doing and we can copy at the same time. So teaching her to knit might be easier said than done. Right, I'm just hand cranking into the corner. Take that pin out. So yes, Emily would like to learn to knit. Charlotte would like to crochet. I think she's seeing the appeal of one hook is easier than 2 needles. So we'll see how that goes. I'm really bad at crochet, so yeah. That may not go so well. But Charlotte, she's 11. She also wants to learn embroidery. So I have bought a couple of hoops, and I've got some felt, and we picked up some random skeins of thread. I think they were DMC. Or were they Anchor? Can't remember. Doesn't matter. So we picked those up as well. So I'm sure that's something we'll do at the weekend. I'm sure there'll be some time on the sewing machine. But whilst I've just said I've got loads of stash, I probably don't have quite enough to be sewing anything too exciting with the girls. Just taking the pins out as I go. Just going a bit off-pieced onto the binding. So my poor brother-in-law, he is currently seconded, well, he's doing like a work experience over in the United Arab Emirates. He's a lung doctor. I know there's an official name for that, but I don't know what it is. He is a cardiac surgeon, but he's currently working on lungs, nothing to do with the COVID issue. He's just out there getting some more experience. But he came in contact with someone that developed the flu, so he is now in quarantine on his own. His wife is currently still in the UK, but she's a community cardiac nurse, and she's been working in the community for years, but she's just been called back to come and do intensive care training. She hasn't worked in intensive care, I think, for about 20 years, but she's going back to do that, so those poor souls. Finding it tough. We're all finding it a bit hard, aren't we? There we go. How far have we got? Nearly there. Oh, take the pins out as we go. Someone messaged me on Facebook this morning saying that they're looking forward to me releasing a particular pattern. I've got a foundation paper pieced pattern that I teased everyone with at the beginning of the year, and I've not got around to turning that into a pattern yet. So I need to have a proper think about what I'm going to do. I've got an English paper piece pattern that's on the way, that's nearly finished, and then I need to decide whether I'm doing something else for Earth Nation paper piecing, or whether you guys would just prefer some videos. Need to have a bit of a think. Hard to decide. Take the pins out, check it's all even underneath. Last corner coming up. I'm just going to pull that pin out a little bit. Slowly, and crank. There we go. Around the corner, and that's where I start. I'm just going to stick a pin just here so I know where I started. And just be careful as well, when you come to turn the corner, you've lifted your presser foot, but actually it looks like the presser foot's down, so always just double check that you put your presser foot down when you're dealing with bulky materials, because the stitch won't form properly underneath. The beginning. I'm just going to do a locking stitch, which is always jolly slow. Cut those threads, and let's move that out the way, give us a bit more space. Ooh, squeaky squeak. So there is the quilt. That is all done. So what I'll do at this point is I'll just go turn over and just double check that this line of stitching here that I've done all the way along, you can see here how it's just, oh, I'll hold it in the right place, hoping that thread was enough of a contrast so that you could see it's just sewn just in from that edge. And I'll just make sure all the way along that I haven't unevenly folded round to the back and I've missed the stitching, missed the edge, just to make sure. If I had, for any reason, things had come astray, is that what I would do, no, that all seems fine. What I would do is, if for some reason I hadn't folded that binding across enough, is that I would just, well, that makes it look like I'm cutting, is I'd stick in a couple of pins, I'd undo that stitching between the two, and then I'd just refold and re-stitch from this side. But that's how I do my binding on the machine. So I'm quite happy with that. I'm quite pleased to hold it up. I can't quite get all of it in, but there we go. That's how I do my machine binding. So yeah, that's what I do. Like I say, I do sometimes use that decorative stitch on the machine as well, because I think that's sometimes nice and it's really quick and it involves less of that feeling for the binding on the underside. So give that a try if that's something that you might like to do. Try on a smaller one, so something like a mini quilt is really nice for that, or if you've been doing my spools of thread and you're looking for a quick way, or it might be one of your first quilting projects, have a look, test on a scrap or something first, have a look, and you might want to try a wiggly stitch or a zigzag stitch, or something might be a little bit more interesting. That gives you a little bit more leeway, particularly if it's a quilt that you're not going to be using on a bed, or you're going to be washing a lot. It doesn't necessarily matter that from the other side that there's that little bit of a lip of extra fabric, because it doesn't matter if it's a wall hanging or something. So yeah, give it a try, give it a test out a few different stitches and see what works for you. So that's me, that's machine binding. I hope you found that useful, and I have filled some of your time when you're sitting at home. But I'm around and about. Message me on Instagram or Facebook or something. I'm always up for a bit of a chat. And have a look out for the sit and sew, because I will do that over, probably do that tomorrow, and I might try and do that every Friday because that's quite nice for people to just get together. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you all soon. Bye.